відсоткова ставка, потім ВВП, інфляція, і якщо вистачить часу, ще поговоримо про зростання цін на продуктовий кошик, але не бачу, вистачить часу.
Скільки нас загалом?
Загалом година. О 2-й маємо завершити. Тому коротко.
It's October 13, Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation. My name is Svetlana Chaparenko, and within the main discussion platform of Ukraine Brain Hub, we have a panel discussion called How Economy of Ukraine Works in Conditions of Full-Scale War and How It Will Develop Further On. I want to introduce our guest today. Is Kozak, financier, economist, investment banker, Ilya Neskhodovskyi, economic expert, Oleg Pendzyn, director of the Economic Discussion Club, Olena Korobkova, Yuliya Markuts, head of the Center of Public Finance and Governance at the Kyiv School of Economics. And joining us online is Olena Korobkova, chair of the board of the Independent Association of Banks of Ukraine. Thanks everybody for joining our discussion. We understand that economic issues were of importance for Ukrainians always, and now during the war, they are probably top priority. So let's talk about the budget. Now it's only a draft. I mean the next year budget. What is your evaluation of the budget for the next year? What are the disputable articles? For example, increase of salaries and pensions. Is it a timely step? Is it logical to allocate such a significant resource for defense and security? So, who is ready to start our discussion, please? Let me start. The overall impression of the budget. First, the articles were removed from there that were aimed at construction, and my opinion in this regard is as follows. There are funds allocated for certain reconstruction fund, and I think it's right. Well, talking about defense, I think we cannot say whether it's enough or not. I think that the funds for defense are insufficient given the condition, given the necessities of the army. I think that we need even more funds, but we're limited with the taxes paid by the Ukrainian businesses. And since our internal budgets, our foreign partners, their regulations prohibit them from financing the armies of other countries, and thus they cover all the other needs which are not related to the army. And talking about the distribution of articles in the defense budget, for example, I'm surprised by the amount which is allocated for defense and industry complex. 52 billion, it's only 3.7% of the defense ministry budget. So the question is what we should win with if we want, and if we understand that this war is about to last for a long period, not like a year or two as we expected. We have to have long-term goals, and one of such long-term goals is a military-industrial complex, and there are prototypes, there are developments in different areas, something we cover, something we don't, but during previous years there were more funds, I think, allocated for defense, and if they were allocated in bigger amounts, we would enter this war with bigger potential, and still we're allocating such miserable amounts. And the question is how those funds will be redistributed, if it's for procurement of Chinese or Turkish drones only, how it will influence economy directly. And my attitude to the budget is like this: where is the economic growth in this budget? Because the program of economic stimuli that was promoted by the Cabinet of Ministers and the Ministry of Economy is not something that will provide a stimuli for economy. Less than a half of those 41 billion are the funds for 579, but let's look who get this money, like big trading agricultural holdings who are profitable one way or another. They were obviously affected by the war, but how reasonable is it to provide such loans to trade networks? We don't stimulate economy in that way. And other programs, in my opinion, only Osela, the extension of loans not for construction of the new homes. It's a social program aimed at people who don't have homes would be able to get them. So my main claim is the absence of economic stimuli in this budget. So what are we about to reconstruct? What we count on? How do we bring our people back if people don't have jobs, if they don't have competitive salaries? Thank you. Ms. Yulia, do you have anything to add? Yes, good afternoon. So first thing, I agree with Ilya that the major part of the funds are allocated for defense sector, but they're still insufficient. Based upon our analysis, for year 24, the defense budget equals to 8 months of this year. So if the warfare is going on, is continuing, we will have to review the budget. We're reviewing the budget currently since it turns out to be insufficient. The same situation will be the next year as well. Talking about the new budget, I think that it will be discussed later. The tax on income of the military, which is currently being redirected. Now, why it was done so? Because there is no internal resource to cover all those defense needs that have to be covered. Like Ilya mentioned, our foreign partners cannot cover those expenses, and we only can cover those expenses using the taxes that we collect inside of a country. We have to find those funds somewhere, and there are some ways to do so. First is to raise the taxes, but the situation is such that we cannot do so. We cannot have our businesses end up in even more difficult situation. Otherwise, we can increase the borrowings, and it's a serious matter because currently our borrowings amount 27% to GDP. Next year is 24% of GDP. It's a huge amount. And if we issue government bonds to issue our previous obligations under the previous issues of government bonds, we still have foreign borrowings, and we don't know how efficient it may be. And the third option is to find other sources to cover the defense expenses, and they were found by redistribution of the income tax of the military. Other things that we have, I agree, not a lot is channeled at the development of economy, but again, I agree that it's difficult to find some excessive funds, and it has lower priority than defense anyway. Also, there are many tax exemptions contemplated for the next year. I may be mistaken, but about 90 billion, which means that 1/3 goes to defense complex. It's clear for the time being, but all other tax exemptions, when we say that every single hryvnia made in this country is channeled at the war, I think it would be feasible to review those tax exemptions. Thank you very much, Mr. Truss. This budget, I would call it the budget of support of democratic countries. For the year 24, it will be the third year of the war. We all understand that the war will continue next year, and the Ministry of Finance has learned to plan the budget for the war year. And it's clear that without Western support, we are not going to survive. This is why half of the budget income is the foreign aid. We don't still have agreements about all that support coming our way. Discussions are still underway. There are dialogues between the Ministry of Finance. There are claims regarding the reforms that we were promising and we don't fulfill them. Still, the half of the budget expenses is financed by the support of our partners, and another part is financed by our taxes, and a third part is the military support from NATO countries, first of all, and some other countries which are not parts of NATO. So if we calculate all those three pieces, the amount will be equal to the GDP of Ukraine, and it's an emergency which is possible only during such crisis times when democratic world understand that Ukraine needs to be supported, and they don't only understand it, but they do support us. But talking about different areas, the macroeconomic indicators for the time being, well, depending on the way you calculate the rate, the state debt is 88%. And next year it will exceed 100%. Previously it would be a critical amount because it was considered previously that 60% is a high amount, is normal to high amount, but now the world has changed and many countries during different crises, starting from 2008 and then COVID-19, then this big war, the democratic countries, they mostly have the sovereign debt exceeding 100%. But since it's still a big amount, the Ministry of Finance is supposed to restructure the debt, and it's quite interesting to what extent it will be related to the sovereign debt and the commercial debt, the euro bonds issued by Ukraine in amount of about 20 billion euro. It will be a big haircut up to 50%. It's clear now, but the commercial lenders, they insist on the government to take part in this restructuring. So basically the loans extended to us by European Union, so basically we want they want them to be discounted so that we owe them not that full amount, like they give us $1 billion and we would be supposed to repay only $500 million. If we achieve this, it will be a great victory of our Ministry of Finance, so that if anybody is affected, then it's everybody is affected, both commercial and sovereign lenders. And as a deputy of a Kyiv Municipal Council, I would like to draw everyone's attention to redistribution of the military income tax. So basically, paying the military income tax to the state budget, I understand the position of the Ministry of Finance. Yes, they have to cover the military needs, but all those military income taxes, they finance the budgets of the communities, and when the state takes all those funds away, promising to equalize the situation with transfers or subsidies, for example, it doesn't happen. So for example, in Kyiv Energo has a debt of about 8 billion hryvnias for compensation of different tariffs. That's for today only, given the fact that the people don't pay for utility services. Some of them just left and some of them don't pay to other reasons. But basically the overall debt amounts currently to 19 billion hryvnias, and the state does not support the municipality. They only promise us something so that we spend our time in the rear. Normally we have to understand that the families of our military, they live in the rear, and this is what they fight for having their families live normally and not oust them from the country. So we have to look for some consensus options. There is already some consensus about the military income tax going to the state budget. Well, Mr. Oleg, Ms. Olena, I understand you have something to add since it's related to the state budget, but nobody touched upon this issue is the predicted rate. This year it's lower than the predicted rate for this year. In your opinion, why this decrease? Maybe Ms. Olena first. Thank you. Well, I would like to start with the budget. Just briefly, if we look through it, through the draft, it's focused on the main things, on the main challenge faced by our country to stand in the war and to win it. I agree with the previous panelists, but still it will be year 11 of the war next year, and that draft budget is mostly about survival and then about other things. There is a minor 16% growth of the salary, minimum salary. It will be 8,000 hryvnias by the end of this year, and minimum pension, the growth of 13%, it will amount to 6,000 hryvnia next year. And the salaries, the growth of salaries in amount 17% for government officials. We need to do all those things, but first thing, we have to survive in this war and to win it. And definitely Ukraine requires external funding in amount at least $40 billion per year. And thanks to our partners, they continue helping us continuously. Previous year, this year, they compensate and they help us with compensate our expenses and help us with their funding. And as Mr. Taras mentioned, in the September 24, the suspended repayment term comes due for amount of about 20 billion, and restructuring is a pressing issue. Talking about the rate, the decisions about the latest changes, it was long due, and its postponement was threatening with accumulation of currency risks. The fixation of the rate had a good stabilizing effect for the economy during the war. However, the long term of maintenance of fixed rate would threaten us with development of anemic processes in financial system. It was creating more risks like the ones that emerged in the years 2012, 2014, and just let's remember how we were burning the reserves. So the rate would be fluctuating within a corridor, and National Bank of Ukraine will limit the amplitude of this type of fluctuations, which will allow us to proceed to the market prices, and we will have to learn to live with the flexible rate. And the first days it was going on all right and the situation stabilized. Mr. Alex, so the rate budget, do you have anything to add? Well, obviously, we started touching upon this issue very gently, and as an investment banker I will go a little bit more profound. So what is the biggest risk of the budget 24? I mean, in relation of all of the economic processes going on in Ukraine, is the foreign funding, the income of the budget will be 1 trillion and expense will be 1.6. So we don't count on any commercial borrowings, so we can only count on International Monetary Fund and also Ukraine as a sovereign borrower. So those are politically motivated funds. So behind every cent of that loan, there are different political things that are described in the memorandum with International Monetary Fund. In a little bit more diplomatic terms, they are set forth in the letter from the presidential administration of the United States that contemplates some unpopular steps, such as bringing the rates for gas supply in compliance with the market prices, so basically raising them 2.5 times. Well, we remember that this year European Union extended 18 billion, and from the years 24 to 27 we've heard the promises of about 50 billion more, but we have heard the statements by Hungary. I think Slovakia will join them, so probably we will be seeing like a half of that amount. But again, we should remember about the elections in the United States next year, and the Americans will make their choice. And we've heard statements from the Europeans that if they continue supporting Ukraine, they will not make it without the United States. What's the problem that I'm seeing here? Let's recall year 22, when we had big issues with the fulfillment of economic functions by the government. What the government was doing, the Ministry of Finance was printing the bonds and the National Bank was buying them. So basically we've witnessing the 400 million of emission that year. As a result, the inflation was 27% and the GDP fall was about 30%, and the rate was falling too. So you were asking what's going to happen to the currency exchange rate for the next year. So if the microfinancial aid will be coming in the full amount, and the rate for the next year in the budget is 41.4, I think that the real rate will be just a little bit lower. If God forbid we have any problems with macrofinancing, the only way to ensure social payments will be reverting to emission, because we have already discussed the issue of government bonds here. We understand there are certain things there, like the total amount of government bonds to be issued. The military expenses are also calculated in that emission. So the biggest risk of the next year and the biggest problems related to the currency exchange rate may emerge in this area. Thank you very much. Mr. Oleg, I think you have something to add. Well, the first thing is where to get money. Look, the government somehow ignores it. They don't solve the problem. Look, solving the problem with the gambling business increased the profits. Well, increased the profits, like the profits were within 1 month were bigger than within 1 year. Look, where was the government back then? Law enforcement agencies were involved, tax administration, banks. They were all involved. They were making money on those schemes, and it ended just like this. So where to get money? Please struggle. Another aspect is the sale of tobacco products. Underpayment of taxes is 21 billion. So where do we get 40 billion within a year? So where is the government fighting those schemes? Then the sale of gas stations. The taxes are back, but the schemes are still back too. So where is the business? The business is fighting, I'm sorry, where is the government? The government is fighting the small business. They revert to cashier machines, so they're basically pressing the small businesses, and according to the estimates of Ministry of Finance, the cost of such pressure is 4 billion hryvnias. So there is certain pessimism here, but this week Belgium has adopted the decision on transferring of 1.5 billion of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. I think it's a very positive step. It will evolve, and that those 1.5 billion were not contemplated anywhere. And if such country as Belgium does this, the same thing can be done to some requirement can be put against other countries, and we may start saying that we need those monies for reconstruction, and it's the matter of interest that is paid for parking of those assets, and the matter of taxes for those assets is something that Ukraine can get to compensate the necessary amounts, and those amounts may be bigger than something that Belgium offered us. Ms. Yulia, 30 seconds for you, and then 30 seconds to Mr. Taras. Another thing we should not forget, that we cannot afford a mission because it's one of the preconditions of our cooperation with International Monetary Fund. So if we have problems with IMF, there will be problems with funding from Canada, United States, Japan. So this is something that in fact we cannot afford. But what we can is to fulfill the requirements of our partners to expedite the reforms, which is the main precondition for successful aid for our budget. We can trace it in IMF requirements, in microfinancial help, in the Ukrainian plan. Everything is aimed at development of Ukraine and at implementation of reforms the soonest possible. Well, there was a question about the currency rate. I don't know, do our spectators follow it? But what is the rate? 36-39. So the fixed rate 36.6. In fact, it was bent to one side. Now it's 36-39. What it means? Is it in accord with the reality? Probably not. Is the rate implemented by the National Bank, and they can put a period there easily, but the goal is to have Ukrainians understand that the currency rate is fluctuating, and National Bank can control it, and some terrible devaluation that was promised by some experts, it's not about to happen. National Bank still maintains the rate, and the rate in the budget, like at the level of 42 hryvnias, it's just about nothing. It was calculated by foreign trade experts to make sure that the rate is the same during export and import operations. National Bank wants to devaluate it a little bit, but the devaluation will be slower than the growth of income of Ukrainians. So if Ukrainians invest in government bonds, 30 seconds, it's very important. So if they do invest, they will have positive result on their investment, even in US dollars. So talking about the debt, Yes, the national bank does not bail out the government bonds after these 400 billion emissions. Moreover, the national bank decreased the amount of that emission. They seized those funds from economy by repaying of number of series of government bonds in amount of about 12 billion hryvnias. There are not much talks about this, but there is the contrary process to emission, and the national bank forces the commercial banks to increase the commercial procurement of government bonds. So the banks buy government bonds, and they will be able to continue buying them to the amount of about 100 billion hryvnias. And also the individuals grow their government bonds portfolios. At the beginning of the war, this amount was about 20 billion, and now it's about 50 billion. So more than twice the individuals, the physical entities, bought the government bonds, thus supporting the country and getting profits for themselves, that the profits that increase inflation and the currency rate. I think the discussion is being built around the currency rate here. Miss Olena is raising her hand. Let's give the floor to her. I wanted just to add that the IMF also made an average forecast on the exchange rate, and it's 41.4 hryvnias for the next year. So it's an indicator of the fact that we shouldn't expect for some serious devaluations. Well, talking about the strengthening of the national currency, it's not the result of good operation of economy, but is the result of pouring of $500 million to the market by the national bank. So it's an inadequate policy of the national bank. They had a tendency, but they reverted it. First it was $500 million, but let's look how much currency they're selling. To what the currency reserves decreased significantly. I approved of that decision on the fixed rate, and I was thinking that the national bank would devaluate in the best interest of everybody, devaluate the national currency, not significantly. It will be in minimal percentage, but it will be in accord with the overall economic situation. And national bank, just like an icebreaker, broke everything, demonstrating something to somebody, but whom they want to demonstrate what? How long can you last with your games with the currency reserves? So the decision was right. I supported by the further actions of the national bank when they decided to go the opposite way, not in the way of the economic situation. That's a very serious question to the national bank and their goal. Why did they do that? I don't understand in whose interest is this approach. Probably in the interest of those who wanted to buy dollars at the very low rate. I just want to draw the attention of our spectators and those in the studio. We have both pessimistic and optimistic part of the future outlook here in this studio, specifically on that, and there are serious contradictions in part of the currency policy. But in fact, when we talk about the rate, the biggest adherent of weakening the rate is the Ministry of Finance, because all of the macro financial aid is incoming in foreign currency, and when the Ministry of Finance draws 42.5 hryvnias per dollar next year, all those social expenses, they expect the foreign currency to be converted at $42, and when they turn their face to the market, they see the rate of 36.6, And just imagine what is the underpayment. We see all those statements by Mr. Marchenko that we have to weaken hryvnias because it's too strong. So we know where it grows from. So the Ministry of Finance also has the expectation of the next year rate at 41.4. This is the same expectation as the IMF has, but they are way bigger than the real expectations of hryvnia they will be able to obtain. National Bank is responsible for inflation too. Apart from other things, it's been pressed on for decrease of the discount rate, and as soon as they equalize the currency rate with the real rate with the forecasted rate, there is a 3.5% difference. It's bigger. Well, it's lower. Well, you see what's the difference over there. So we currently have 8.5% just during August. The National Bank has drawn an indicator, a goal of 10.5%. So they will maintain the rate. Mr. Marchenko, the Minister of Finance, is going to dislike it, but the National Bank is responsible for inflation. It's not in charge of unemployment, as for example, Federal Reserve. They're only responsible for inflation, and they will hold it to the best of their capabilities. And talking about the forecast of IMF, do you know what is the forecast of IMF for the end of the war? Summer 24. Yes, in summer 24, this is the forecast of IMF when the security problems in Ukraine are going to decrease significantly. This is in line with the forecast of the National Bank of Ukraine. They say that in August all Ukrainian ports are going to resume their operation. I don't know. We can just think that they made this statement just because they had to make some statement, but the fact is the fact. We should treat any forecasts very carefully. Well, let's talk about those forecasts within a year, after a year. Well, Mr. Taras, I will switch to inflation right away. Well, talking about the rate, there is such a phenomena as rate expectations. As soon as the National Bank starts the devaluation of hryvnia, Ukrainians expect this devaluation to be indefinite, 45, 60, 65, and it's reinforced by different statements by the experts. So the bigger rate you state, the bigger of an expert you are, the more quoted, the more cited you are. It's very clickable, you know. And National Bank understands it very clearly. So the growth of devaluation expectations means the growth of inflation, because everybody understands if dollar grows 5%, all the prices grow 5% too, maybe even 10%. This is why the NBU acts in line with the long-term expectations to restrict the inflation, and we have to admit they seek what they want, because the inflation since the beginning of the year is 3%. We think that the inflation is huge, but if we check out the statistics, the most objective details that we have, we don't have any other. Within the 9 months of this year, the prices have grown 3%. It's very little. Within the previous year, it was 7.3 years. It's higher than the expectation of National Bank, IMF, World Bank. So the policies of National Bank of Ukraine, they have very solid results, the positive results. And the currency reserves is something you have to accumulate during good times and burn them out during the crisis. Now is the crisis, so is the very moment when at the account of the currency reserves we have to maintain the rate of the currency, and this is exactly what the National Bank does. And to corroborate what I'm saying, the daily rate of burning of currency reserves, the National Bank on the 2nd of October announced about the manageable flexibility or flexible manageability. I'm getting confused about those terms. And on the very next day, on the 3rd of October, they've burned about $520 million. It's too much because they've sold the amount they usually burn within a week, within a month. No, it's not within a month. Like within a day, they sell about $2 billion. Or per month they sell $2 billion, or per week is 500 million. So it's like now we are burning about $100 million per day. The rate is the same, it's 36.6. The hryvnia is stronger than previously. The currency reserves are at the same level. If the national banks moves the rate to 38, 39, my forecast is that we burn about $500 million per day, because the liquidity of hryvnia is huge. 500 billion of hryvnia is placed in the banks, and the people would start buying the dollars because we would have burned more reserves. There would be uncertainty in the country, and Ministry of Finance would require even more hryvnia to procure those things at the price plus 20%. Thank you very much. You've touched upon the topic of inflation. I wanted to smoothly proceed to it. So I'm curious about your thoughts, about your opinion. What's going to increase the inflation? Let's start with Miss Olena. She has her hand raised over there. Thank you very much. In fact, what I would like to say is that within September, the pace of inflation has slowed down. It's 7.1%. In August, we hit 8.6%. In the beginning of the year, it was more than 20%. But if we check out the statistics, the official statistics, in monthly indicators, the prices have grown only 5%. And obviously what we were talking about, what the National Bank is responsible for, that step taken almost 2 years, well, less than 2 years ago, year and something, I mean, in terms of the discount rate, raising it up to 25%. In fact, inflation is twice slower now. It's quite predictable. And if we check it out in midterm perspective, I see the potential to decrease the discount rate down to maybe 15%. And if we talk about inflation forecast for the year 2024, all of the government forecast is built on the expectations regarding year 23, but we see that the government expectations of the year 23, they are not actual, because they were saying that the real GDP will amount to one figure in year 23, but the figure is completely different. And the Minister of Finance has stated recently that the renewal will be 4.7%. The average annual inflation was forecasted at the rate of 16%, but in reality it's 7.1%. Well, obviously average annual will be a little bit different, but it will be way lower than 16. So those are the figures that we should look at as a reference point, but let's not horrify anybody. Don't wait to overcome the inflation completely, and inflation targeting at the level of above 10%, in my opinion, is a very good approach. Thank you very much, Mr. Ilya. Let's put it like this. The merit of the National Bank in slowing down the inflation is minimal, because last year when we were talking about this, it was a different decision, it was not on a monetary nature. If it would have been of monetary nature, it would have worked differently. You know, that billion would not have gone anywhere. So the National Bank has taken inadequate decision by cutting. They cut down the lending. The lending is going on under 579. The businesses cannot take loans during the war. They don't have investments. So national banks started suffocating all of the Ukrainian businesses by 25% discount rates, and they allowed the banks to make more money, More than 80 billion hryvnias were made by commercial banks within the war. It's an absolutely inadequate policy during the war. And respectively, though, those funds, they remain there. Those 80 billion are profit for nobody knows what, because it's just the National Bank issuing money, and they take money from Ministry of Finance because their profit on government bonds is tied to the discount rate. So what is the country in this world where the discount rate is 20% and inflation is 7%? What 5% cut are we talking about? We should have the discount rate at 10%. That would be the adequate decision. And talking about the forecast, look, why has the inflation grown if it's not a monetary factor? First of all, it's logistics. The fact that we have a major part of our southern territories occupied, and the supply of fruits and vegetables was cut from there, which resulted in growth of prices for products from there significantly. Yet another part is the supply of energy resources. The profits of the companies that ended up under shellings were destroyed, relocated, and then it's the matter of logistics from abroad. The seaports are closed, and bringing goods by motorways and railway, those logistics routes were not arranged so far. Our checkposts in the border were not able to let all those products through. It created internal deficit, which was putting the prices up, and we had inflation back then. So those factors are now removed, and the role of National Bank is such now that they continue convincing us that they did it, is their merit, and they continue having this 20% discount rate. I have no words, actually. All the negative reactions are tied to that step, because this decision is not in line with the normal policies. We used to have the situation when the National Bank in 2019, after the longest period of economic growth, the National Bank with their activities, they just destabilized that economic growth by playing with the exchange rate and playing with the discount rate that was inadequate. They just stopped the economic growth. And now when we need the resources for the growth, for reconstruction, where is the policy of the National Bank of Ukraine, the one responsible for the financial system of the country? How do they ensure proper funding of economy, financing of businesses? It's non-existent. So let's talk about the average consumer. We've talked about the growth of salaries, minimum pensions in the budget. So will their average consumers perceive it, or the inflation is going to neutralize it? So the biggest contribution to the slowing down of inflation of Ukraine is made by the Lord himself, Almighty. Because this year we have extremely good harvest. In year 22 we've sown 10% less than it was harvested in year 23, including the temporarily occupied territories. Tracking this matter, the Ministry of Agrarian Policy has drawn a figure below 10%. We've harvested about 70, and they were saying it would be below. We've harvested about 74, and they said it would be below 70. Ukrainian Grain Association says that if everything goes well with corn, we'll harvest up to 80 million tons. Ukraine, so we understand it, given the existing amount of population, we need like 12 million tons, and the rest is export potential. And by the way, the fertility of 1 hectare is 1.5 times bigger than the last year. So yeah, it was definitely the God's hand here. The Lord loves Ukraine. I have nothing to say here. But again, I agree that National Bank had done nothing to overcome inflation, and by maintaining the extremely high discount rate, they just made the money remain in the accounts of the banks. They made the money extremely costly. They decreased their circulation of the money, and thus they decreased the prices. So on one hand, the high discount trend hits the development of economy, but on the other hand slows down the inflation, and it's desirable to find a compromise between one thing and the other here. So this extremely high discount rate, unfortunately, it holds the economic growth back, and the only window that the businesses can get through is this 579 program, whether they want it or not. Will the National Bank of Ukraine decrease the discount rate? Yes, they obviously will, but I want to remind you, again, I said that the Federal Reserve of the United States is in charge not of inflation. They are responsible for the level of unemployment in the United States of America. That's why their policy is usually aimed at intensifying the business activities in the United States of America. According to our legislation, National Bank of Ukraine is in charge of inflation, and thus we have the policy which is aimed at decrease of the price proposals. And well, please, the briefest possible, 20 seconds, 25, 25 the most. Look, in the year 22, Ukrainians lost about 25% of their real income. That's the official data from State Statistics Service. In the year 23, about 60% of Ukrainian businesses didn't raise salaries. Yes, 7.2 rate of inflation is great, but if your salary is not rising, but is not growing, and the inflation is 7%, you're still losing. The fact that the minimum salaries and minimum pensions are supposed to be raised next year and should be re-indexed, it's not an extraordinary step, it's the only step possible, because again, the main market for the development of internal manufacturing is the internal market, it's not the foreign market. And everywhere, all the politicians, all the economists, all the policies of economic growth are aimed at heating up of internal market, and what the government plans to increase the income of the population is the very correct step. But let's remember where we started. The sources it should be filled from are the foreign funding. Mr. Taras, just very briefly. Well, mandate of the National Bank is the stability of national currency, which means low inflation. If low inflation is achieved, then the second mandate is the stability of the financial system, the banks. And I want to expand here. As a result of the full-scale invasion, our banking system lost a lot of their assets. NPLs are currently at the level of 400 billion hryvnias. What should we do about this? Should we just withdraw the markets from the market or refinance them at the expense of the local budget? It will only expedite the inflation. So the National Bank, by raising the rate, ensure the incomes, the profits of the bank, who could decrease their losses which resulted from the big war. And if the two mandates are fulfilled, the third mandate is the growth of economy. They don't come up to that point because it's on the third place, but if the inflation is growing, we won't be able either to defend the country because the budget will be insufficient for anything, because the growth of inflation means the growth of expenses to cover all the military needs, pensions, salaries of the military. This is why I support the National Bank. However, we should decrease the discount rate as soon as possible. I think that probably it will be decreased to 15, maybe 16% this year. I agree with Ms. Olena. So talking about the average citizens, the National Bank protects the interests of the average citizens because they are the ones who need low inflation. Because yes, the real salary doesn't grow. As soon as it does grow, the real income of the population falls. So this is the policy of fighting for average Ukrainian. Thank you. We have time for one question. Vladislav Obuch, Ukrinform. Talking about cooperation with IMF, do you believe that the second review of the program will be successful for our country, that we are about to receive another tranche this year, even without compliance with the structural benchmarks for the end of August or end of September? I would like to ask you to answer very briefly. I'll try to answer. Look, the biggest donor of IMF is the United States of America. Look, IMF doesn't have their own money, right? So if we check thoroughly the memorandum, if we check thoroughly the requirements, so the requirements of the American administration, they are very coherent. So I think we are about to get another tranche in amount of about $2 billion. Next year we have 800 billions. We have received 890 billions this year, and due to political motives, like we don't comply with some of the items of the memorandum, and in view of certain budget problems on part of the USA, we will receive the tranche, but not because Ukraine has done something right, but it's only a political thing. Again, all the foreign aid is politically motivated, and we should clearly realize that all the things, even if they are not complied with, but our foreign partners need them, well, they will happen, and I think that we will pass the next year without any additional questions. I appreciate the input of all of the panelists. I thought you were about to have a fight, but thankfully it did not happen. Well, I'm reminding you, we were talking about the economy of Ukraine and the conditions of the full-scale invasion. We analyzed the latest decisions of the National Bank of Ukraine, and Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform will continue its operation on Monday. Thank you for staying with us.